How Latin secretly conquered Russian and you never noticed. Think Russian and Latin have nothing in common? Think again. Every time you use words like minister, Congress, or even czar, you're speaking Latin without knowing it. Here's the shocking truth. Latin didn't just influence Russian. It invaded it so thoroughly that you can't speak modern Russian without using Roman words, the ancient family connection. Let's start with the deep history. Russian and Latin are distant cousins, both descended from Proto-Indo-European, a language spoken 7,000 to 8,000 years ago somewhere in the steppes of southern Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, our linguistic ancestors might have been neighbors. The shared ancestry explains why basic words sound similar across languages. Papa, mama, brat, brother. These aren't borrowings, they're family resemblances. When Russians say otets and Romans said pata, they're using evolved versions of the same ancient word. But that's just the beginning. The real Latin conquest of Russian happened much more recently. The legal invasion. Romans gave the world something revolutionary, a coherent legal system. Roman law was so effective that it became the foundation for legal systems across Europe, and all those legal terms came with Latin names attached. When Russians started building modern legal institutions, they didn't reinvent legal vocabulary. They just borrowed the whole Roman package. Advocate, advocatus, prosecutor, procurator, appeal, appellatio, juridical, juridicus. Even the word legal itself comes from Latin legalis. Russian courts today are basically speaking Latin with Russian grammar. Every legal proceeding is a linguistic tribute to ancient Rome. The political takeover. Government terminology. Also Latin. Parliament, minister, Congress, quorum. Romans invented these concepts and the words stuck. Even when Russians think they're using purely Russian words, they're often wrong. Take tsar, seems totally Russian, right? Wrong. It's Caesar, the Roman emperor's title. The word traveled from Rome through Byzantium and Bulgaria before landing in Moscow. The first person to use the title Tsar wasn't even Russian. It was Bulgarian Emperor Simeon in the 10th century. Russian rulers spent centuries calling themselves by a Roman emperor's name and thinking they were being authentically Slavic. The scientific colonization. Medieval Latin became the international language of science, like English today. When Russians needed scientific vocabulary, they didn't create new words. They just adopted Latin terms wholesale. Mathematics, medicine, biology, physics. Entire scientific fields in Russian are basically Latin with Cyrillic letters. Minus was used by actual Romans, but sinus and cosinus were medieval inventions using Latin roots when scholars translated Arabic and Indian mathematical texts. When Russian scientists discover new species, they give them Latin names according to international nomenclature. Russian biology textbooks are half Latin vocabulary that students don't even recognize as foreign, the stealth influence. Here's what's really wild. Most Russians have no idea how much Latin they speak daily. Words like university, universitas, culture, cultura, nature, natura, maximum, maximus, minimum, minimus. These feel naturally Russian but are pure Latin imports. Russian borrowed so seamlessly from Latin through other European languages that the foreign origins became invisible. It's linguistic camouflage on a massive scale. The humor factor. Latin influence on Russian has become a source of cultural humor. The legal phrase dura lex sed lex, the law is hard, but it is the law, gets playfully twisted in Russian as dura lex sed lex no dura. The law is hard, but it is the law, but so stupid. Russian speakers instinctively recognize Latin phrases and adapt them for comedy, showing how deeply Latin has penetrated Russian linguistic consciousness, the living-language connection. Unlike dead borrowings that just sit in the dictionary, Latin in Russian remains active and productive. Russians constantly create new words using Latin roots, make puns with Latin phrases, and use Latin-derived vocabulary in creative ways. It's not just historical influence. It's an ongoing relationship where ancient Roman word-building patterns continue generating new Russian vocabulary. The invisible empire. This reveals something profound about how languages actually work. Cultural influence doesn't always look like obvious conquest. Sometimes it happens so gradually and naturally that the borrowing language thinks the new words are native. Latin conquered Russian, not through military force, but through intellectual necessity. When Russians needed vocabulary for law, government, science, and abstract concepts, Latin provided ready-made solutions that were already being used across Europe. The modern reality. Today, educated Russian speech is probably 20 to 30% Latin-derived vocabulary, but most speakers are completely unaware of this. They think they're speaking pure Russian while actually using a language that's been fundamentally shaped by ancient Rome. It's the most successful cultural colonization in history. Romans convinced everyone else to adopt their vocabulary while letting them think they were using their own languages. Every time a Russian says student, professor, examination, administration, constitution, or revolution, they're speaking the language of Caesar and Cicero. Rome didn't just conquer territory. It conquered minds and tongues so completely that we're still speaking Latin 1,500 years after the empire fell, and we don't even notice. Makes you wonder what other native parts of our culture are actually foreign imports we've forgotten about, doesn't it?